Welcome to Greenwich and the Environment. I'm Diva Wareing, your host, ready to take you on a journey through the heart of creativity, culture, research and sustainability at Greenwich. So, whether you're passionate about the planet or just curious about the hidden forces shaping our world, stick around. This is where sustainability meets creativity. Let's get started. Water is fundamental for life, yet availability and quality are increasingly threatened by climate change, pollution and consumption patterns. Art and creativity entertain us, but can they solve our water crisis? With me in the studio today is Dr. Benz Kotzen. Benz is a landscape architect, academic and researcher who was born in Johannesburg, South Africa. He has worked on projects in the Middle East, the US and even on islands such as St. Helena. We're here today to discuss Benz's work in aquaponics, landscape design and how by combining new and old technologies we can solve real-world problems. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me here.
No, it's great. Yeah. It's great. Thanks for coming and speaking to us. I'm really excited about our conversation. You've got such a diverse background. You originally studied a BA and a Master's in Fine Arts in your home country, South Africa. You worked in advertising and then you went on to study landscape architecture in the US and the UK, which has developed into your forever career. So can you just tell us, how did all this happen and how has this journey shaped your perspective and your research?
Okay. If we go back a very long way, back to South Africa when I was a kid, I guess, thinking about it, I wanted to be a farmer or a forester. So I think my kind of my link to the environment was also always kind of there. It seemed to me that the environmental side or the outdoor side was very important to me. But my sister, who's 3 years older than me, she became an art student, a fine art student. And I thought, well, this is a little bit sexy. I want to do a little bit of the same. And so I decided to go down the route of fine arts. So going to university, obviously skipping school and all of that. This is also, of course, during the apartheid era in South Africa. And, going to kind of art school, etc., I thought I was pretty good. And I was probably just a little bit overconfident. And, I think, looking back on it, which I can do, I thought I was going to be famous. And I think like most people who go to do fine arts or who want to kind of become a painter or a sculptor, they think they're going to be Picasso or the next best thing.
Yeah.
So that's where I started off and I did well. And then I was fortunate enough to get a travel scholarship. And I think even before that, thinking back, I was obviously a student. And growing up in apartheid and being a student under the apartheid regime, people probably don't know much about this, but we did kind of demonstrate and we kind of put up a bit of a resistance as kind of students, as you would expect, students to do. Anybody who had kind of any liberal kind of background, which I did. And I remember quite vividly being chased by police dogs and kind of climbing up a lamppost very, very quickly, just, with the kind of big Alsatian's teeth at my heels. But that was kind of, it was kind of fun at the same time,
There was an exhilaration there.
Yes, exhilaration and being a part of something and being anti kind of establishment. So coming back to this travel scholarship, which I was going to be preparing for my master's, I realized actually that that what I had been doing wasn't so good and wasn't so clever, that really for art to be relevant, it had to be, or for art to mean something, it had to be relevant to the society it was in. Now, of course, South Africa, there's a great heritage of landscape painting and of the local people, etc. And they're brilliant artists in the same way that you kind of sometimes see about Australian, indigenous Australian art, etc. So there was that. And there were people who were kind of had shown historically what a wonderful country it was and, brought something out about the culture and society of the place. But I realized that I could not do something like that. I could not paint people. I could not paint landscapes. I couldn't do anything abstract. etc. I couldn't kind of do a Rauschenberg and a Jim Dine or Hockney or whatever it is. I needed to kind of say something about South Africa, about politics and apartheid, etc. So basically, what I did is I made anti-apartheid posters and I stuck them up on the streets of Johannesburg, and came very close to being arrested and put in jail. And who knows what happens? What happened to people who got put in jail? Some of them never came out.
Oh wow.
Okay, I mean I'm trying to think of, there's some famous Biko, for example, Steve Biko. Everybody's probably heard about him. He died in detention. Now, of course, he was much more involved in the movement than I ever was. So this kind of story or narrative is really how I changed from kind of the arts-based, although kind of pure arts-based, to something like landscape architecture. And the idea for landscape architecture really arrives from my feeling that actually art needed to do something for society, for the environment, and therefore, I could do landscape architecture, which kind of brought together a design-based skill or experience, etc., with trying to better the world in terms of landscape design and environmental design. And so that's why I went to the States and then eventually to the UK to finish off my landscape degrees. So that's kind of where it all started.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you mentioned that you did the protest art during the apartheid.
Yes.
How do you think that art can be used within social justice movements, especially for things like sustainability and bringing them forward? What do you think the positive can be?
Well, I guess, again, I think, art should be about communication. And, of course, the kinds of communication available for people today is so much greater. The opportunities are so much greater. The ability to create films, there are so many films that have been done on the environment that have reached millions of people. Just on, for example, having things that are open access or on the web. So, there's so many opportunities to do it. And I think one can do it in an artistic way as well as kind of in a more serious way. I think, our previous discussions have basically said, or we talked about it, is that we don't want to use language and media, etc., that obfuscate the kind of the issues that we're trying to do. So they can be simple. And if we go back, let's say, to kind of Marxism or kind of early communism, etc., where they use kind of these trains which had images on them, or the kind of Marxist posters, communist posters. They were so strong and so powerful, and we appreciate them for their aesthetic kind of principles and beauty. And I think it's the same thing. So the media might have gone on for quite it has extended and become more powerful and more readily available for everybody to use. But so we need to do that. But we can change the messages. It doesn't matter whether it's about doing wrongs in society or doing wrongs in the environment or trying to change people's attitudes or minds or whatever. So I think the opportunities are there.
Amazing. Well, I think it's great, and I think I completely agree with you. I think art is such an amazing tool, when it's used correctly. And yeah, you're right. There's so many films and TV shows and everything. I mean, at the beginning of January, I watched that. I think it's a Danish show, but it's set in La Palma, off the coast of Tenerife.
Yes.
And I think that was such a good show to highlight how climate change is impacting volcanic eruptions and stuff like that, but in such a nice, creative way. And yeah, I think I fully agree with you. So your research has spanned across many topics.
Yeah.
But the one that we're going to talk about today is water and the water crisis that we face. Can you just really quickly sum up what is the water problem we're currently facing? If it's possible to quickly sum that up.
That is, of course, I think there's so many aspects of water. We all know that water is the source of life. Without it, everybody dies. We can last without food for a long time, or little bits of food for probably months, but with water we'll die within a few days or 5 days, etc. So we as human beings, and of course when we talk about the planet, etc., and plants, etc., plants need water, etc. And then, of course, the impact that we have on water is horrendous, or it's immense. And then I guess there's just, so we're talking about aspects of pollution, for example. And then I guess also with climate change, water itself water can be absolutely wonderful. It can be in a pond, it can be in a swimming pool, it can be in this little cozy stream, etc. But we know about the tsunamis a few years ago, or even recent tsunamis and hurricanes, etc., the danger that water can actually have. So really, when we're talking about the issues of water and today and climate change, we're really talking about context, and so many different contexts. It's very difficult to kind of put it into one place. I recently was involved in a reviewing task with a number of other people who were looking at getting children to understand the problems of the Mediterranean and of the Adriatic Sea, and I think the Black Sea. And there were a number of kind of these countries, Italy, Turkey, Croatia, all these countries around the Mediterranean, Spain, Portugal, etc. They were all vying for about 10,000 euros for their kids to kind of, they would use this money to go on trips and understand problems relating to the sea and water. So some of the issues that came up, for example, were plastic pollution. And that's a real big problem, because not only is it kind of, destroying just the water quality, it's getting into kind of the fish, and we eat the fish and other things eat the fish, etc. So, we probably all have plastic all in our veins, etc. I'm not an expert on that, so I don't really know. So that's kind of horrendous. And then, of course, it's all about biodiversity. We are losing biodiversity, and we're losing kind of the creatures that we don't know much about, etc. But we're losing the kind of cuddly things like turtles, and how cuddly are turtles, and the turtles don't come anymore and create their nests on certain Mediterranean coast. So, it's got to do with pollution. The sea levels are rising, therefore we're losing certain kind of biodiversity in them. We know a lot about that in terms of the coral reefs, etc. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, of course, is, sometimes we have too much water in one place and then not enough water in the other place. Sometimes, actually, it's got nothing to do with people. If we went back 10,000 years, the Sahara was like the savannah is today. And not many people know that. And actually, what's kind of interesting, there are paintings that show the people who lived there, like the cave paintings, etc., of the animals who lived in that kind of area. Yeah. And there are remnants of the water that are there that still have crocodiles, and I think they still have antelope. And I was going to say hippopotamus, but maybe I'm wrong. But it's so sometimes things happen which are beyond our. It's not our fault. But very often it can be our fault. And so, for example, desertification happens. That could be because of climate change. It can also happen because of poor land management. So people, for example, overgrazing or putting too many animals on a thing, or over planting, etc. And there's just not enough water to bring the life back again. So, again, as I'm saying, I probably missed a lot out, but there's water's really got to do with context.
It's quite complex.
It's complex. It can be too much in one place, too little in the other places. But there are ways, if one's astute and one really looks very, very closely at things, then there are kind of solutions that we can use.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully we'll get into those solutions throughout the rest of the podcast episode. So if we just focus on water scarcity, and your early research focused on desert plants and water conservation, can you tell us a little bit about that research?
My research really started from a kind of interest in looking at how people viewed plants of the desert. Now, a lot of people, whether it would be in the Middle East or whether it be in the United States or South Africa or Australia, would actually go out into the bush and into the environment and go kind of on safaris to go and look at their plants, because the plants are absolutely amazing. Of course, they're very seasonal and often come up only when the rains. So I got very interested because when I started to look at people's gardens,
So this would be like a trip.
Yes.
Or a holiday kind of thing for people.
I mean, yeah.
That's so nice.
Yeah. I mean, you can go for today. You could probably go to a great number of tour companies that will take you to go and look at the wildflowers of the Alps or of the Mediterranean or whatever it is. And this happens all the time. You know, people would take their kids, especially school kids, to go and look at let's say in the Middle East, to go and look at the geophytes, the bulbs, and some of the plants that really come up at springtime. And very often, these are very specific and endemic to these places, so very, very valuable. And then I would look at people's gardens, and I couldn't understand why they were using English roses, lavenders, all the plants that we can buy in our nurseries here, but they were using them there. And I was trying to understand why they were doing this. And obviously there was a very strong tradition of Western gardening, which kind of built its way into these kind of societies. And they never ever thought of these native plants of actually being valuable. So that's where it really kind of started, my research. And so what I was trying to do was trying to say to people, okay, you might be using this plant, but actually you could replace it with this one, which uses a tenth of the water that the plant you're using uses. So that was all about kind of saving water. And whilst I was doing all of this, I started to note the amazing aspects of nature and micro-landscape conditions, which actually would create conditions where the plants could survive, where they wouldn't otherwise be able to survive. So, for example, one of my trips into the desert, in the middle of absolutely nowhere, you find one shrub. Okay, in the most harshest of conditions, there's one shrub. And you start trying to figure out, why is this shrub growing there? Yeah. First of all, you have to get the seed there. Now, the seed could have come by the wind or could have come by water, etc. And you start looking at it, and basically there are three types of main desert. One of them is kind of the sandy desert, which we all think of as a kind of Sahara. But then there's another kind of desert which is very stony, which is kind of rocky, bigger rocks. And there's another one which is a more of a stony kind of gravelly desert where all the top layers have been blown off by strong winds. This was the kind of desert that this was in. And what had happened in this, where this plant was growing, there was a depression, a slight depression, and this depression, and also there were no stones. The stones in the other part of the desert have been oxidized, and they're dark, they're black, and that basically means actually what happens is they absorb the heat, and these stones heat up. And, to a considerable degree, 50 degrees. So nothing's going to grow underneath these stones. But where you have the white sand underneath, which is reflecting the heat back, it's not affecting the plant. So the reason why this plant is growing there is because there's just the slightest difference in this kind of landscape, what I call micro-landscape conditions.
Wow, that's
and
so
also,
interesting.
and then there's it's kind of slightly dished, this piece of land. So instead of the plant getting water when it did rain, let's say every few years, instead of the number, or maybe it drizzled a bit occasionally, instead of the amount of water that it was getting just by the plant itself, it's getting it from a much greater area, and it's concentrated at the plant roots. And then, for example, many plants themselves, cacti, for example, and many other kind of things like tamarisks, will have needles and leaves which will absorb dew, and then this will drip around the roots. So they're getting more water than they would. So they're landscape and nature-based solutions. Nature knows best. That actually enable plants to survive, and at times people as well, because people would be able to drink the water that's coming from the dew that's coming from these plants, or be able to collect this water as well. So that's where my research went into, is kind of trying to figure out how we can best collect water using kind of what nature is teaching us, and then also the landscape as well.
That's amazing. That is amazing. I've seen quite a few things. I actually worked with a girl who studied ceramics, and she was working on a tile that would capture. It would replicate what there was a desert beetle. I don't remember which one it is, but it would replicate what this desert beetle would do, which would be to capture dew. She did it with this tile.
I've done the same thing.
Oh, amazing!
Yeah, I worked on it. So basically, I've written a paper. I did about I guess it was a year-long piece of research looking at alternative methods of kind of collecting dew. And this is one of the things I looked at, obviously this beetle. Somebody had done research. It's called a tebrionid beetle. It comes from Namibia. And what it does, it kind of collects fog. And the fog, basically, it sticks its arse up in the air.
I think this is the same beetle, actually.
Yeah, it's the same beetle. There's only one. It's got this very hard carapace, as beetles does. It sticks its arse up in the air, and then the fog collects on this carapace, and it drips down to the beetle's mouth. Now, I figured out also that basically you have hydroscopic and hydrophobic materials. So obviously, a beetle, for example, is got a skin which is hydrophobic.
Could you just explain what those two things mean?
Okay, so hydrophobic, phobia means against, or etc. Hydrophobic means a kind of material that actually will shed water. And in fact, today, for example, we have glass, and I think on this building we're in Stockwell Street, we'll have a glass which has got a film on it, which actually doesn't allow water to settle. Or actually, when and it's actually self-cleaning glass, because what happens, glass gets dirty with dust. When it rains, this glass just all runs off and it self-cleans. So it's hydrophobic, and there are a number of, any glass or sometimes plastics and things like that are like that, and you can put films on to do that, to be effective. And then the hydroscopic is basically that you can attract water, so it will hold water rather than shedding it. So the two ways of actually, for example, if you wanted to capture dew or fog in certain kinds of areas, you could either use the hydrophobic or the hydroscopic method. So the one with the hydrophobic one, of course, what you're doing is, for example, something, let's just say you have a roof of a house, you can direct the dew or the fog, or even rainfall, of course, as well, off the shed or the sloping thing and into a gutter and into a barrel or whatever it is. Now with the hydroscopic one, for example, you might have some kind of spongy material, etc. What you would do is this stuff would collect the water within it, and my idea would be that what you do is kind of like a salad spinner. You would spin it, and all the water would fly off to the outside, and there you would collect all the water at the bottom. So there are lots of opportunities to do that.
That's actually amazing.
Yeah.
And another thing that you've worked on, which we've spoken about, is aquaponics.
Yes.
And you've done some amazing research into aquaponics at the university. The rooftop gardens in the Stockwell Street building are incredible. First of all, can you explain what aquaponics are? Okay.
Again, it's not so simple. And now, aquaponics is, although it's kind of thousands of years old technology, the kind of revisitation of aquaponics as a new kind of technology is relatively simple. And actually, it's a kind of a misnomer. The name is a misnomer. But essentially what aquaponics is, it's the combination of growing fish and vegetables or herbs or any kind of vegetation using the same water. So how this works is basically, if you feed the fish obviously get their nutrients from the feed. They obviously then, like everything that kind of eats something, will excrete the waste products, and the waste products for fish actually come in three kinds, not just urine and feces. It also comes from what their breathing apparatus, so from the gills. So the nutrients that are coming from the fish once they produce urine and from breathing is mainly nitrate. Okay, and that goes into the water. But actually, it's not coming into the water as nitrate. It's coming into the water as ammonia. And then, of course, there's the feces. So what actually happens to the ammonia that's coming in as ammonia, which actually over time will develop into amounts that are toxic not only to the fish but also to the plants. There are microbes that occur naturally in the water over about a 6-week period. They will transfer that ammonia into nitrite initially, and then into nitrate. And then nitrate is a perfect fertilizer for plants. It's one of the 3 main kind of constituents of a fertilizer. So by feeding the fish, you're actually getting the nitrate out, and then you can grow the plants without adding any other kind of fertilizer. This is very, very good for leafy plants like lettuce and other kind of herbs and things that are leafy, basil and things like that. When it comes to fruiting plants and flowering plants, etc., they need more phosphorus and potassium. But these nutrients are also within the kind of excrement from the fish. But what people have been doing now is extracting that effluent. So it's basically feces, and it basically goes to the bottom of your filter system in a sludge. You extract that filter system, and then you can basically put them in an aerobic system or an anaerobic digester, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then you can extract the phosphorus and the potassium from that, put it back in the system, and then you've got pretty much a kind of circular system, which, basically, as long as you keep feeding the fish, everything's okay. The aerobic basically means what we do is we take the feces, which is a sludge in the water, and we basically just put an air into it. So we're pumping air into it, and again, the microbes that occur that are just kind of breaking it down into its kind of nutrient constituencies, and we do that here. But in other places, there are advantages of doing it anaerobically, so it's in a controlled things, because it produces biogas. And so the biogas, you can still get the phosphorus and the potassium from the sludge afterwards, but this produces biogas, and therefore you can actually run your system off the energy if you wanted to.
Wow.
Or you could use the biogas for anything else.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Wow,
I mean, the reason why I said it's more complicated is because the definition of aquaponics, it means different things for different people. And now there's systems. What I'm talking about is a circular system, but now people have found that it's probably more commercial, actually, not to take the water back to the fish. You just take the water off to the plants, and you use it on the plants, and then you get rid of the water. The term that we kind of, or the best way for us, I think, to explain what aquaponics is, in terms of the pure principle of aquaponics, is when at least 50% of the nutrients that goes to the plants or the plants need actually comes from the fish. Because otherwise, anybody who's says they got an aquaponic system could just have 1% or 0.1% of the feed coming.
Fall into greenwashing.
Yeah, it's green. Exactly, it's greenwashing, etc. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, obviously, aquaponics is good for conserving water if you have that circular system, because I guess you can just use the same water over and over again.
Yes. Growing produce in aquaponics probably uses about 10% of the water that you'd normally use in normal kind of agriculture.
Wow.
Of course, we're also not talking here about hydroponics, because hydroponics is its own thing. Maybe that's something for another day.
You told us that it can also be really good for food security and nutrition.
For me, there are kind of 3 important strands to aquaponics that people need to look at, and that it's important kind of for society. The first thing for me is commercial kind of aquaponics, and in a way to try and make our food more sustainable and available, kind of at an economic price. people have managed to do this in the United States, not so much in the UK and in other areas. The second one, which I think is important, is to look at urban aquaponics. And I think we realized during the pandemic, actually, that, we weren't very secure in terms of our food supplies, etc. And we know that through wars and all sorts of things, our food supplies could be cut off any moment. And so any food that we can grow locally in our cities, or close to our cities or an industrial estate, makes us just that much more secure. And that's possible because you can put an aquaponic system. We could put it in a studio here because we could put it outside if the weather was better than it was, and in the tropics, for example, all the aquaponic systems are outside because they don't need greenhouses. And, we can put it on derelict sites waiting for development, on tops of roofs, on car parks, so you could put them pretty much anyway.
And the commercial yields from these, can they get quite high yields from aquaponic systems commercially?
Yes. The difficulty, and we come down to aquaponics and aquaculture and hydroponics. So the difficulty with aquaponics, in the kind of big commercial sense, is that basically what you're doing is you're growing more than one product, and each one of those products wants something slightly different. And so it's like it's like multitasking, isn't it? You're probably not going to do such a great job as if you were doing them separately. And so, hydroponics is where you grow food using a water stream which has all the nutrients that are perfected for that one particular plant. So I'm not sure you're aware, but most of our tomatoes and most of our cucumbers and peppers, etc., are grown in greenhouses, either east of us or south of us in Kent, in the most huge greenhouses you've ever seen in all your life. And they're grown hydroponically, and basically they're giving the conditions for that particular plant, perfect conditions, the perfect lighting, the perfect temperature, and the perfect nutrients for that plant. When it comes to aquaponics, it's kind of you're balancing the needs of both the fish and the plant. So it's not perfect.
Right. So it seems like it might be more achievable on a smaller scale.
Yes, and I think more, and that's where it does come into its own in smaller communities where it's more successful. Also in places, for example, like in the United States and Canada, where they have really, really bad winters and stuff, and where, for example, they might have a building, and they can take the hot air and the carbon dioxide from that building and put it into one of the floors of the building, and then grow the crops, the fish, and etc. So it can work in a city kind of situation, but it might be better to be in a kind of more localized situations. For example, where they are pretty successful in supplying produce to local markets, to restaurants, etc., where people are really careful about what they buy. If this is aquaponics is, basically it's organic.
Yeah.
And it cannot be considered organic in this country or in the EU, and that's ridiculous reasons for that, and I can explain that to you. But in the United States, each state has an individual kind of authority that looks after its organic certification, and in some of the states it is considered to be organic. And of course, people who want their children to eat organic food or themselves to eat organic food and know where their produce is coming from. We don't know where our produce is coming from. No idea. So if you can know where your produce is coming from and it's safe and it's not using pesticides and chemicals, etc. And that's one of the advantages of aquaponics. We cannot use any chemicals or pesticides because you can't kill your fish.
Yeah.
And so that's a good thing. So the thing that's most important to me about aquaponics is really its use in the developing world, and really in the developing world, because I think we probably talked a little bit about this, is in the developing world, because, for example, in Kenya, where I did some research, I went to Kenya, did some research in terms of habitat restoration using drones and using seed bombing. Okay, that's another story. But whilst I was doing this research, it became very obvious to me that in these dry lands of Kenya, for example, if you are away from the Great Lakes of Kenya, like Lake Victoria and some of the other lakes where you can get fish, the populations who were a long way away from these areas were nutritionally deprived. They were extremely poor. They had no, basically if the rains failed, they were all subsistence farmers. They had no redress about getting any other food. There's no refrigeration. The transport is bad. So you cannot get fresh fish or anything like that. So by having these units, which are, could be used and built using local materials, if, for example, you could have these units attached, let's say, communally to a number of houses or villages or whatever it is, then these people will have an alternative source of protein and vegetables, the nutrition that they need, and also an additional source to create some kind of income which they need. And then, of course, it's also very, these places don't have a lot of water, so it's also extremely water efficient. In a similar vein, the research that I was doing is looking at restoring grasslands for pastoral people in East Africa. Now, what's amazing about pastoral people in East Africa, we just can't get our heads around this, is that for thousands of years, there are no fences. It was the first time I'd ever seen a place without any fences. So they would take their cattle and their not horses, cattle and sheep and goats and camels, etc., and go walking, 1,000 kilometers and whatever it is, and they'll go, with the rains, etc. But because they cannot do this anymore, because there are no more grasses, because of climate change, etc., they really need an alternative. If you can't restore the grass, they need an alternative livelihood. And this could provide them with, they do stay in one place for a bit. And if you have an aquaponics unit, etc., then you be providing the food that they need. So for me, that's really, really important. Okay.
So your research has looked at aquaponics from a range of different things. But one of them that I find really interesting is that the research hasn't just stayed within Earth. It's expanded, and you've spoken about sending fish to Mars. How do you see aquaponics playing out in future space exploration?
So, Kenya is not quite Mars, but actually some of the landscape, this is interesting, because some of the landscapes of Kenya and the northern part, going into Somalia, etc., could actually be Martian. And so actually the segue into this is quite good, because basically, on the moon, for example, and on Mars, we don't have something that's called soil. Okay, we in order for us to have soil, we have to have organic material in amongst the kind of mineral material. And actually, in these northern areas of Kenya and parts of Ethiopia and Somalia, etc., these are just barren rocks, etc. And this is what we, for example, have on the moon and Mars. These are rocks, and mainly on Mars anyway, it's basalt that has been eroded through radiation, through water a long time ago, and also through wind, etc. So what we have is kind of Mars sand and Mars dust and Mars rock, etc. Nothing will grow there for various reasons, apart from the fact that it's like hot as hell and cold as hell, and the radiation will kill everything. And there's no water. The soil could not support any life. Okay, so the idea is, for example, if you're on the moon, I think I said this before, that if you're on the moon, you could probably get your McDonald's in a day or two, because the moon is not so far away. If you wanted to take your McDonald's to Mars, it's going to take you 8 months to a year. So it's not going to. That's how far Mars is.
That's a cold McDonald's.
Yes, it's a rotten McDonald's, or
maybe,
or yes, it's a frozen McDonald's at least. So the thing is that basically what you have to do is it's inevitable that you have to grow your own food there. Now, of course, as I said, it's such a hostile environment outside, you're going to have to grow it inside. And the whole thing about the movie The Martian, you saw that Matt Damon was using his own feces to grow potatoes and stuff. And basically that's the principle. But potato, you can't live on potatoes alone. So you have to, we know that we need some kind of protein, and we could get it from soyas, etc. But we could do this with fish as well. Now, the benefits of kind of having an aquaponics unit is that, for example, if we had fish and vegetables growing on a planet now we know has water, should have water, so we'll have the water there. What we really just need to do is, obviously, we need to take the fish as small fish or eggs or whatever it is, and then we can take the seeds and we can grow them there. And what happens is we can not only grow food within the aquaponics system, in the circular system, but the detritus, or for example, when you cut off the old leaves of the lettuce or the roots of the lettuce, we can put that in a compost bin, and we start getting kind of compost which we can add to the soil, which means then we start getting a living kind of soil. And then also what we can do is we can take, let's say, the fish and the bits and pieces of the fish that we don't eat, we can compost that as well. And so we're adding additional nutrients to the soil. So we're going to create a much richer kind of soil environment to grow food. And that can be perpetuated and be very long lasting.
Wow. I guess you could do this, because I mean, there's talk of we only have 50 harvests left within our soil system. So I guess this could be something that could happen on Earth as well.
Yes. In fact, we've been doing research here. So, for example, in most very many aquaculture farms, which are kind of basically, aquaculture is obviously the farming of fish, and some of this is on terrestrial, on the ground. Obviously, some of it's at sea. But the kind of aquaculture water is thrown away. And I had a PhD student working exactly on this, on trying to take the fish nutrients and then using it kind of as an additive to agricultural soil. And he proved, for example, we did limited numbers of vegetables, but he proved that actually using fish nutrients, fish feces, etc., is better than using kind of animal fertilizer, or just as good. So yes, it definitely can.
That's amazing. That is genuinely amazing.
Yeah.
How do you think that creative innovations such as aquaponics can help to solve real world problems, environmental problems?
I have the belief, or I have the philosophy, that we can do just so much with technology. And technology is going to increase over the kind of efficiencies, and the types of technology going to increase, and it's going to make us more productive and more clever, and et cetera, be able to do many, many more things. But I think the power, if we start kind of combining technology with what nature offers us, which is what kind of aquaponics does, it actually is going to be the way forward. I think one of the problems is that over a period of time, I guess maybe since the Second World War, probably, and until the 2000s, or into the 2000s, or maybe even now, we've forgotten actually what nature gives us. The benefits that, and I think many of them we still don't even know. There are the traditional ways of using nature that are, indigenous people have passed down to us, and we've forgotten them. We poo-pooed them. We're saying, okay, we can do better with technology. We know, for example, that most of our medicines, most of our cures, etc., are nature-based. And there are many, many more still to come, and many more derivatives that still have to be found. And I think in the same way, so for example, we're talking about, okay, it's on the radio probably every second day, about reintroducing or beavers and wolves and things, putting beavers somewhere is kind of, they've solved all sorts of kind of flooding problems. We're going back to water. They're beavers, you know. They just kind of gnaw wood and kind of stick it in a pile, etc. But isn't that kind of amazing? We don't need to use concrete, you know, which is unsustainable anyway. So I think in order for us to be clever, we really need to kind of honor the opportunities that nature kind of give us and kind of look at that, but then also use technology combined with nature in its most powerful way.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think nature has all the answers. We just need to listen and look into it and accept these answers. Yeah. And accept our limitations as human beings.
And not be greedy.
Absolutely not. So the apartheid shaped your worldview, and now you focus on being part of the solution. What advice do you have for young sustainability researchers looking to make a real impact?
I think they have to have a passion, for sustainability. And we are having this discussion about sustainability, whether it's this kind of all-encompassing word, etc., which is no longer valuable or useful in a way. But I still think it is, because I think it's a way to gauge, you know, whether we are going to pass on a world that is of any worth or not. And I think we haven't, although everybody talks about the tipping point, I don't think we've gone over the tipping point. I think we can still recover from it. I think, people, working in sustainability now have to have that belief. I think, first of all, it's the most important thing is they have to have the belief that they can do something, that it's not all hopeless, that it actually, their mission on this planet is to do something. I think that has to be a strong belief. You know, if I asked you the question, why are you on this? Why are you here? Why do you think you're here? I won't expect an answer. But from a sustainability person, or from anybody, for example, who I teach landscape architecture, if they don't say to me, you know, I want to help the world, I want to do something that's good, then I think, well, just go away.
Yeah.
You know, it's like when I was a teenager and I wanted to be a famous artist. You know, if that's the point of it all, then you might as well just give up and just go away.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean the advice is, I think, in a way is, look at, we're talking about how important nature is. Look at the detail of nature. There's just so much there. Every time I kind of look at nature, I have been, ever since the pandemic, I have been photographing one flower, well, more than one flower, but at least one flower every day. And I've been sending that to some colleagues and some of my family. And I haven't stopped every single day. I don't know how many days it would have been, 1,000 days. I don't know how many years it is. But what it does for me, actually, is I take a very close-up photograph, and then I look at, what I've done, and probably I don't look carefully enough, but it's just amazing. You know, the kind of detail that's in there, the structures that are in there. And I guess, from a kind of real boffin point of view, the DNA that's in there and the chemistry that's in it, etc., it's boundless, it's endless, etc. So I think we're just starting to learn from nature, and I think, people just have to be inquisitive and also be adventurous.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, we're coming to the end of our conversation now, but speaking to you, Ben's, always listening to your research and speaking to you and hearing what you have to say, it always fills me with so much hope for the future. I feel like everything that you're doing is leaps into the right direction. And I guess actually this leads us on very nicely to our final question, which is something that we're asking all of our guests, is that when we were developing this podcast, I was like, there's so much negativity in the world, and I feel like it's so easy to pick up a person from the street and be like, what do you think 2050 looks like? And they're like, it's fire, it's this, all these negative things. And I feel like in the 80s, there was this technology idea of how the world's going to look, and it was a kind of hopeful vision. So part of that is I wanted to ask everybody, what is your hopeful vision of 2050 and what does it look like?
Okay. We very often ask our final students to kind of draw up a master plan of something what it's going to look like in 2050. And they're all kind of weird and wonderful. I'm hopeful. Again, as I said, we're not at the tipping point where we're kind of headed for disaster. And I guess, as far as nature is concerned, I think nature can recover. Maybe not everything can recover. I think nature, for example, again, we know that time is kind of endless, and time brings change, and change is always difficult, and we find it very difficult to accept change. So we don't want to accept change just because we're making change. If nature brings change by itself, I think we need to accept that. I mean, I think the hope for this world is, there are two scenarios in a way. Human beings can just wipe out the planet, through nuclear holocaust and stuff like that. If that happens, there's nothing we can do about it. However, if that's not going to happen, I think people have the ability, if they collaborate, to change things dramatically. And that's all it takes. I was thinking about it. If you have, a generation is what? I think a generation is based on when you can have children. I think it's 15 or 20 years. Let's say it's 20 years. In 60 years, you have 3 generations. If every one of those generations is taught to love each other, respect the planet, and this goes through school, and it's done internationally, etc., we will end up with a world where we can not destroy the resources of the world. Everybody will be on the same same pathway, in the same kind of mind frame, and I think. And we talked about greed. If we get kind of rid of greed, and we have a population that the world can support, and we have the technology that can help us to produce the food without destroying the environment, that and that's going to come, because it's going to get. We know, for example, we can produce more food more effectively, more efficiently, with less resources. So I am hopeful, but I think the key thing is, everybody says the future's in the children, and it basically is. If we teach children correctly, then I think we're okay.
Amazing. Thank you so much for speaking to me today. Okay. This has been amazing.
No.
I can't wait to hear what other exciting research you end up getting up to, and hopefully you can come back onto the podcast and tell us all about everything I should do.
I'm sure I've missed out a whole bunch of stuff that I should have said. But anyway,
that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Benz.
Thank you for having me.
See you later.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. This podcast is brought to you from the Creative Futures Research Centre and the Sustainability Development Unit at the University of Greenwich. So, from all of us here, see you next time.